Hey, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. My guest today is an NBC news anchor. She is a career journalist, a mother of two, and a hoot to talk to. We went really in depth hitting on topics that are affecting our local teens and news in general. We talked a lot about different ways to assess the reality of the world that we live in and her part in that and the news machine in general. I really appreciated my time with her, and I greatly appreciate her perspective. Without further ado, the woman, the myth, the legend, Jessica Aguirre. How are you, Jessica?
I'm good. I'm excited to be here. I am impressed with your setup. This is super, super pro.
It is a good time. I will tell you that. I do like going on Amazon and grabbing little bits. But ultimately, it's an interesting position to be in as somebody, doing this very, very minimal, I wouldn't even call it a broadcast, but putting information out there, because it used to be, which is one thing I want to talk to you about, it used to be that there was this grand barrier to entry with information dissemination, right? So you had obviously your news outlets and you had your newspapers and things like that, but it used to be that unless you were capable of getting in line with one of those companies, you weren't going to be able to get your ideas out.
Right.
And then came social media, so people can get ideas out, but with with the low barrier to entry in that kind of world of like you can post anything on Facebook or Nextdoor or something, you get just this abundance of information that's very low quality. But if you make a small investment, like these mics are not that expensive, the cameras are not that expensive, the lights are not that expensive. If you make a small investment, you can actually develop reasonably high quality content to put out into the world and broadcast, so to speak.
Which is clearly what you've done here. I mean, you have this studio that really is set up to look like a professional studio, which I'm really impressed. And I think the other part of that is you actually have knowledge-based information, which is great to disseminate and put out in the public. And I think you're right. We're in a different era right now where everyone can almost be a citizen journalist or, a citizen pundit and put their ideas out. And I think that's fantastic, because the more ideas and the more expertise that we can tap into, like what I've done with you when I've brought you on my broadcast to talk about, how do we make it through this pandemic? How do we, teach kids? How do we prepare them? How do we do all this? That's information that we needed to bring out to the public. I think where there is a fine line is what is trustworthy that you can hear and that you can go to for information, because it's very easy to say everyone should have a voice, and it's true, every voice should count, every voice should be heard, but not every voice has fact-based information that you should take as your mantra. There's been an erosion of the belief in fact-based news, and that's been happening for a really long time. It used to be in the old days, the Edward R. Murrow days, that you had these 3 behemoth networks, and that's where you tuned in every day to look at hear your news, or you turned to those local newspapers, that those were the ones that you relied on for your information. A lot has changed, and certainly the advent of social media and the internet, that you can have all this information accessible to you really quickly, is phenomenal. And it's been a huge boon and a detriment to network news that I do, right? Because we have access to information faster than we've ever had it. But it's also placed an undue pressure on us to always try to outdo each other with such speed that the quality of the work and the accuracy and the efficacy of the work can sometimes suffer. So we've had to double down on efforts to make sure that happens. Where there is this kind of vacuum of uncertainty is when anyone can get on and start espousing what their personal beliefs are without any fact-based knowledge or any credible sources to back that up. That's how we end up with things like QAnon, where seemingly something as what most of us would think is completely a far-fetched idea, that, that Democrats and Republicans, some Republicans, are running a worldwide, sex trafficking ring out of a pizza parlor in New York. I mean, on the face of it, you laugh. It seems ridiculous,
it's
right?
so out there. It's so
but
tremendous.
It's on Facebook. It's been propagated in various, outlets throughout there. There are people who are now complete QAnon followers and who go ahead and espouse these ideas to other people. And now we have this phenomenon where this is a part of our presidential race right now. Something that seems absolutely absurd. And that's just one of many conspiracy things that's been propagated by people that have access to a microphone and that have access to giving out their beliefs.
Right. Here's a question for you. As you pointed out, there used to be this real concentration, access to information, access to broadcasting ability, and those people tuned into those stations to get the facts of the day. But I think, and I would ask you this, do you think that a fact is still a fact with people? And what I mean by that, let's take another wild one. So the flat Earth theory, right? This is out there. So what's a fact to somebody looking at that? They look outside. They can't see the curvature of the Earth. Right? So for them, they say, hey, look, where's the circular Earth? Right? This looks flat. Or they fly in an airplane and maybe they don't even have great eyes, but like it kind of looks flat. Or they can. The point is, what we're experiencing now, I think, is a shift in the way people discern facts. It used to be that you'd read a physics book or any kind of book that talked about the Earth being round, and you're like, okay, well, I'm going to take this book, right? Because I'm experiencing this book. And there's been this shift via, let's say, YouTube that allows people to get sucked into this dialogue that presents the world, instead of presenting a physics book, it presents other compelling information that they don't have the wherewithal or the life experience to say that's actually not true. Because you could have a life experience. You could be an astronaut and go up into space and you're like, there's the Earth. But nobody has those experiences.
But it's been a steady erosion of science that we have seen throughout the last decade, and also this kind of idea that's been, you know how like they say anxiety is contagious, or when you put a group together, the masses can be contagious, the way we act in a group. Well, when I think you've had this steady growth of people that have been putting out their ideas, and people latch on to that because they have no other way of proving it. Yeah, I could read a physics book and it tells me that the world, that the Earth is round, and I have to take it by what the physics books are saying me because I've been trained to think, what the scientists must be saying has to be accurate because there's a series of steps in place to prove or disprove whatever scientific theory is put before them, and it's a huge panel of people around the world. But if you're a conspiracy thinker and you think, well, who are those scientists? I haven't seen them. I don't know them. So I think we keep moving toward this freedom of idea mantra that people have. Nobody wants to believe anything anymore unless they see it for themselves. And the problem is there's so many things that we can't see for ourselves. And quite frankly, so many things I know I wouldn't even be capable of understanding if I could see them myself. Like the theory of the black hole. When I start to read those stories of black holes and I read it, I'm like, I don't know what the hell I'm talking about. I have to do it in the most simple, basic terms that I'm not a scientist. So when I start to read those papers on the black hole, I'm like, okay, I got to get somebody to explain this to me because this is beyond my capability of understanding.
Right, but as again, we saw there's this dispersing of fact. You're saying people want to experience it for themselves because, like you're saying, look, there used to be a panel that got together and made this physics book, and this was the best knowledge that we could look to. Very much like we used to have news broadcasters. People would determine what the best and most reliable information was.
But I think people have lost trust.
Yes,
there is
that's
this
the point.
Erosion of trust, and then when you can't trust the world, when you decide you can't trust anyone, right? Then you have to say, well, I'm going to have to trust myself, my own ideas. But we're not capable, most of us, are not capable of looking at all these different things, whether it's climate change or whether it's, the Earth. How are you and I supposed to prove that?
Right. So I'm interviewing. Here's one for you. I've been interviewing all of the candidates for the Board of Education in the San Ramon Valley District.
Okay.
And I spoke to the union president recently, and I spoke to the president of the Board of Education, and they don't get along too well. I mean, this is obviously a very difficult time.
Yeah.
But both of them came onto the show and said, hey, we are working in the best interest of the students, and this is how the conversation has gone. So both of them said that, and there's an enormous amount of detail to sift through to figure out, okay, were these negotiations fruitful as this person said, or were they completely useless as this person said? So as you have an erosion of an agreed upon reality, right? You have an erosion of agreed upon life experience. And and as you're saying, you don't know who to trust anymore. And I think that's to some degree what has happened throughout the world, and at the very least this area, because you have people that are having lived experiences, right? Like the unemployment rate might be great. It might be really low. Well, the lived experience for the guy who's out of a job, like, well, that's not
100%.
me. People keep talking about how things are so
Correct.
well. That's obviously not for me. So as people start losing trust in the larger body that tries to pool data together, they have to fall back not on another trusted body, but they have to fall back on their lived experience.
100%.
And that becomes their fact. So all of a sudden, we are all living different fact-based existences because fact has now been defined as what's your lived experience.
Right. But I think we have to come back to the point where we can decide what a fact is. You know, people love to say, well, that's my truth. I think that is...
I love that saying, my truth.
That's my truth, right? And while it's a really fun expression to say in the moment when you're trying to mitigate some sort of circumstances between you and someone else, because what your life experience is and my life experience is, and we say, well, that's my truth. I have an issue with that when it comes to journalism and science, because the truth is the truth is the truth. There is no your truth or my truth. It's your experience and my experience, but the truth doesn't change. But I think that that's been what we've seen over the last, decades, and especially we've seen it, certainly in the last few years, where if you say something enough, loud enough, strong enough, and you keep repeating it, it's almost like being hypnotized. It comes to the point where people start repeating it too. So if I keep saying to you, oh, well, that's my truth, eventually you're going to believe it's my truth too, even if it's completely the antithesis of what your truth is.
Okay, but what you were saying, look, a fact is a fact is
a fact.
Okay, but even that is so wishy-washy. Okay, and let me give you an example. When we had the riots going on in Walnut Creek, okay, property damage, looting, all kinds of things, and the
protests that ended with some people rioting.
Yes, and God bless the protests and damn the rioters and looters and stuff. Whatever. I mean, people should be able to protest 100%.
100%.
Let's remove it. Let's just say that there were large groups of people that were breaking the law by breaking into to stores. Okay.
Right.
The district attorney put out a statement advising the police, I believe it was the police department or the sheriff's department, to consider the motivation behind the acts, okay, and to consider what their situation was. Now, that's true. People got a hold of this and said, oh my God, she's condoning theft. California's burning to the ground, right? Now, that's a fact. It's also a fact that there are several different designations of theft. So there's armed robbery, there's burglary, there's looting, there are all these smaller designations.
Right,
so
petty
like
crimes.
Exactly. They all have to do with me taking something from, let's say, the Apple Store.
Right.
Okay? They all have to do with how we actually book the criminal. Okay, because again, was it premeditated? Was there some big plan, or was this person walking by and just threw a brick and then somebody ran in and grabbed something? Like, what was the motivation, right? What was going on in that person's head? She was not saying, do not charge criminals. She was literally putting out a clarification of how to address charging them when you're considering these different levels of theft,
Right.
Okay? That's a fact. So people on both sides of this argument get to espouse
really
a fact.
She put that out, that she put it out as a fact, but her decision of how she wanted to handle it is not a fact, because the DA has the latitude to decide how she wants to. So there comes her in her own preferences and her own latitude within the statute and the thing. So that she put the thing out as a fact, how she wants it handled is not a fact, because she has latitude to move in one direction or another. So is that really a fact?
Well, this is what I'm saying. How she handles it on the back end is up to her.
Right.
What she was saying is, hey, when you grab somebody for stealing something and you're going to book them with something, because again, if you're, I mean, horrible example, but if you commit manslaughter and somebody charges you with first-degree murder, it's not going to
100%.
stick,
Yeah,
right?
right?
So she was saying, hey, look, this is how we look at these laws. So when you're booking these criminals, you have to consider these things in order to get a charge that will stick.
But that's also making a decision subject to interpretation of the law.
100%. And it's difficult because you have to prove, obviously, premeditation and all these other things. But she was saying, look, this is how we look at it.
Right.
She was not emphasizing, as some people spun it as, she is saying, look at the consideration, look at the person, because you should be lenient, which is how people spun it. So when I'm talking about
People look at things through the prism of their own experience.
Yes, and even though they're looking at the same facts,
Exactly.
they spin it in a different way. So the facts now become, okay, it's a fact that she said that, but it's also a fact that she was saying it in this context.
But we find that if you look at my business, the news business, you can see, depending on what, I should backtrack. But let me just say, you can take the same set of facts and it can be presented completely differently depending on what news station you look at it. Okay. So what I always say to people is, it's very difficult sometimes for the public to discern or figure out, where do I go to get that fact-based news, right? Because you have so many outlets right now. So what I always try to tell people is, we all watch cable news. I have it on my car everywhere I go, and I flip between channels all the time to hear. And I'm often, myself, even as a journalist, taken aback at how I'll listen to the presentation of one story on CNN, and then I'll flip over and I'll listen to it on Fox News, and I'm literally listening to two different stories, even though the facts are the same, but the spin is not, right? So... But when people ask me about that, I'm always very clear, and I always say, I watch CNN, I watch Fox News, I watch CNBC, I go through the gamut, Bloomberg, all of those. But I watch them knowing that what I'm watching has an opinion. Cable news was designed to take a position. And so when you look at cable news outlets, you have to watch them. I try to say you watch it as an observer, not as an absorber, right? So observe versus absorb, right? Because, both of those stations were created, both of those big outlets, to have a position. And you have your journalist within that, and then you have your pundits. And I think a lot of people don't realize what the role of a pundit is. That pundit is there to espouse a singular track of information from a singular position, right? So you got to be able to watch that and know, okay, yeah, well, let me take this with a grain of salt. Let me back up and let me look at the facts. And then, so I think you're closer to what is fact-based news when you look at some of the networks, because we still have to abide by, and we're human, so we're fallible, and we all bring our prejudices. It's impossible to say you're not going to bring your own vantage point to anything. But what we do is we try to be aware. What are my biases, and how do I make sure that my biases don't go into this story? And then there's another person after me that looks at it and says, well, let me make sure my biases are not in this story. So that's why you have a series of checks and balances to make sure that you're giving the facts as they are.
How do you do that? Because this is one of the things that I've realized is really tricky for people to communicate in a way with each other, even on a one-on-one level. How do you communicate with somebody from a position of more objectivity, even though you might be emotional about a certain topic? I mean, you have done incredibly risky and emotion-evoking reporting, right? Like, that's just the way it goes. And you have been able to maintain, as much as a human being could, an objective, look, I'm trying to get to the bottom of this position. And it seems so difficult being someone who you're a human being. and you have considerations, you have your own opinions, but to not lead that into talking to somebody so they become defensive or you're spinning it or, so you're completely dismissed. That's essentially the kiss of death when people just say, oh, well, whatever. I think the news media, the network news is really pushing hard to come back to this real fact-based thing because people have accused them of being very biased.
Right. I can walk down the street and people yell fake news.
Oh my God. You're like, no, I'm really here. Times. I'm really here. I'm standing here. I'm not fake.
No, right? So I think, there's a couple little things to consider in this conversation is that one, the news has changed since those days, in the 1960s when, we saw, President Kennedy get shot and the broadcasters were very stoic. They were holding their emotions back. They were stoic and firm. And that's the kind of news that we had back then. And that's wonderful and that's great. And that's what we learned from. But as consumers of news have evolved, newscasters have had to evolve now. When they did a big study on what do people want to see, especially when it comes to local news anchors. What are they looking for? And one of the biggest things people want is they want a connection with you. They actually want to see you as a real person, as a human being, right?
Not robotic.
They don't want you to be robotic. They want you to be real. They want to know that you have a sense of humor, that you don't take yourself that seriously, but that you're engaged in what you're doing with a level of seriousness, right? That you're committed to what you're doing. So, and that you're factual. So that's a tightrope to walk when you have to be super factual and yet you get to see who I am as a real person. So the way I like to look at it is, there are some topics that are universal to the human experience that we can collectively all say, that's horrible, that sucks, and that's scary. That's what I put in my category, right? So I feel like in those instances when we can universally agree that something is horrific, that's when you're given the opportunity to, in a soulful way, in an emotive way, connect with the viewer. So what I mean is like, there are some topics that people agree are terrible. Being molested by a child molester. We all agree. No one's going to stand up for the molester, right? Okay, that's terrible. Your house gets taken over by a fire. Losing everything you have or your family in a fire. That's universally bad to everybody, right? Having your child die in a car crash. Universally bad, right? So if we can all agree on those are the moments in stories where you can show your compassion and your humanness as well. And people are grateful for that. There's been many times when I've done stories like that where I've actually couldn't help myself from being in the moment of choking up because we all agree that's horrible, right? Where you have to be very cognizant of bringing your own self to the party is when you are dealing with stories that have to do with facts that can be disputed, with ideas that can be disputed, with positions that have both sides, in which it's the viewer's role to figure out how they feel about that, right? So whether you're talking about a proposition and you're laying it out, then you have to say, hey, this is what it'll do on this end. This is what the detractors say. This is what other people say. Okay, now it's yours. What do you think? What works for you? So I would say in those areas of politics, in areas of law, in areas, of disputes in a county, disputes in a city, neighbor disputes, those things do have both sides. So it's my job to put myself out of it and say, all right, here are the two sides. You tell me what you think. Of course, I'm going to have my own opinion, but I have to be very cognizant of bringing my own opinion out of it.
How do you manage then? Okay, beautiful answer, and I get where you're coming from. How do you manage dealing with the nebulous nature of those hyper complex, not a black and white situation? Because, for instance, the shorter, or not short, but the long interviews I've been doing with the Board of Education people, I mean, these are 1.5 to 3.5 hours. Mm-hmm. And at the end of 3.5 hours, or even an hour and a half, you're kind of like, oh my gosh, I have so many more questions.
Right.
And so much comes out that it's so difficult to put together the complete picture. And I've been thinking about it a lot because as I've been doing these, people have been getting a hold of me. They're like, I didn't know about any of this.
Right.
I said, yeah, I didn't know either.
Yeah.
But the point is,
Isn't
if you're
that great,
not,
though? Isn't that the beauty of exploration?
It's
of being able to
tremendous.
sit and talk with someone and just take an idea and then take that idea and go deeper into that idea. And it's like an onion. You just keep finding more and more information. It can feel mind-boggling and overwhelming, the minutia of information that's out there that you keep finding out and discovering.
But it's so beautiful.
Yeah.
I mean, because you dive into this just well of a different life experience and you start seeing these relationships between other people forming. You're like, oh, I'm getting it now.
Right.
But because it's so complex, I think a total I've done like 10 hours with the Board of Education candidates. It's like, whoa, we still only have about half of the whole picture.
Right.
So how do you guys figure out what to present to the viewers as, hey, this is what one party says, this is what another party says, you take it from here, when the detail and depth,
Right.
especially with something that's not black and white, like somebody's house burning down, that's pretty black and white.
Exactly.
But something that's complex increases in depth and the vagary, essentially. But how do you deal with that?
Well, that's a really tough situation, too, because I think, the beauty of what you're doing is that you get to have these long format conversations with people where you really get into the details of it. And that's what I loved about my education show when I had it, Class Action, because we would sit for an hour and discuss in depth, go underneath that layer, and really be able to, break it down in a more natural, man about town way where you could really feel it and understand it. The difficulty that arises is in our super fast, I don't have time for anything world, is that we are limited by time. A story on TV news, will only give you as much information as you can squeeze into a 2 or 3 minute interview, right?
Right.
And so that's also why you see more and more where we say you want to see the complete interview, go to our website. We've posted it all out there. It used to be in the old days, you didn't have access to any of that information. Now we're in a position to say, okay, we've taken what are the most important touch points of this story, probably the things you'll most care about, and we put it in a nice, easy way for you to look at. But if you want more, go look at it here. And that's why the erosion of the newspaper is so frightening, because the newspaper was that place where you could go and you could, do 2 and 3 pages on a story to really get in depth. So I think what we do is we try to wade through all of it, right? And then put out the top few things that are going to be the most impactful, for you to help to make the decision whichever way you're going.
Gotcha. And that makes perfect sense.
It's
because
like a condensation, like a sieve. We go through and we try to weed out all the stuff that's just not that is important, and give you the most important things, which people always want to know. The basic principles of what people want to know is, how is this going to impact me and my family? Right. Is there a danger to me and my family? How is this going to impact me financially? What are the benefits for me and my family? And then I think more and more people are trying to say, not just me and my family, but what's the benefit to my community? What's the benefit to other people around me? And can I sacrifice a little bit to make sure that that person over there gets a share of what I'm getting as well?
Right. And I think you're hitting on something that I was going to get to eventually, which is how has the shift in technology and media actually benefited you guys? Because the cable news has been taking a hit, right? Because kind of what we were talking about, there are a lot of different people who can get a microphone or a camera and just start talking.
And I think there's also a level of distrust with cable news now that's been, an erosion that we've seen in the last few years, that there is this sense of distrust. Right.
But allowing the viewers to kind of get highlights, but then delving deeply in you say, hey, go to our website, you can see the full 1 hour interview. The small snippets seem like such great ideas, but more frequently than not, I really find it's like, well, look, taken in context of this whole thing, it kind of means something a little different, but it doesn't matter. You guys got to do what you have to do as far as, hey, I'm restricted by airtime, I only have 2 or 3 minutes to get through this interview, but the benefit of having that long format kind of conversation with somebody has got to be immense, because it seems like that's a lot of, when people have the time, that's a lot of what they want to get after.
And I think it's twofold there. First of all, most people really don't want to listen to the whole thing. I mean, that's the plain truth
Sure,
of the whole
because
situation.
most people just don't have time.
They don't have
It's
the
like-
time, and especially now, people are running around. I'm teaching school in the morning. I've got to work. I still got to do my work. Then I've got to cook dinner, and then I've got to do all these Zoom calls that I didn't get to do. I mean, not just now, but this is what we've seen in the last few years too. We live in a high pressure, move forward, keep moving forward society. This is what we're built on right now. So everybody wants it digested and given to them, in small pieces, unless it's something they're super, super interested in. If it's something that really touches them, then they want to be like, okay, I'm going to need to know a little bit more about this, right? So a classic example is like last night I did my Race in America show, right? So this is a conversation that Marcus Washington and I have every couple of weeks that we started after the death of George Floyd. And so we have been having these hour-long and sometimes half-hour-long conversations where we bring in, experts, and we talk about the landscape of racial equity in this country. And we try to have really uncomfortable conversations, because race is a difficult thing to talk about. And so you have a black man and a Hispanic woman, and we're having these conversations about, how does this look like for you? How does this look like for me? How does it look like when we both look out in the world? Okay, what are the differences? What are our shared experiences? And what are other people's shared experiences? And where are we at the world right now that we're having this global shared experience? Well, so that's been great, because it's given us this format for an hour long, have these conversations where not only we interview people, but then he and I reflect on our own experiences. And I've had the great opportunity to say to Marcus things like, do you ever walk around and not be black? Can you? No, it's a legitimate question, because I have the experience, even though I'm Hispanic, that there are many times, because of my socioeconomic position, because of my work, because I'm, seen in the public eye, that I can spend a couple of days not feeling Hispanic, because I don't live the Hispanic experience every single day, right? But he can't not be black that day. And I needed to know, does he just walk around and forget he's black? And he said to me, no, I'm black all the time. And what he meant by that, when we talked about it deeper, was, he's black when he walks into a store and someone looks at him sideways until they realize it's Marcus Washington, and they're like, oh yeah, you're the guy from TV. Or he's black when he walks out, to a park and someone says, hey, dude, you want to play basketball with me? All those subtle systemic racist things that we have, or internal racist things, he feels them all the time. He can never not be black. And it can feel like a burden. So those are the type of conversations we're having. But back to what we were saying. So
that's beautiful, by the way. I think that's awesome that you guys are doing that.
It's for me, it's been such a wonderful experience. And it's been a great experience for the viewers, but it's been a great experience for both of us to be able to talk about these things and explore it, and then take it with you and think about it for a few days and reflect and come back and go, oh, yeah. I have a better understanding of that now. But so what we've done is we've taken all of those shows and then the long format interviews, because some of them we do live, some of them we do taped, inside that, and we've put it on our website, and we've said, okay, come watch it. Come experience it with us, and then tell us what you think about this, right? So that's where technology comes in, where you're able to, in the real old world, it'd be like you did it one time and it was lost.
Right.
Now
we used
it
to have
lives there.
VCRs on, with like a timer set. I was thinking, no joke, I was just thinking about that. I did this one with the president of the teachers union at San Ramon Valley Education Association. And people, I was thinking about it because I did it at 7 to 9 at night, and then I posted it immediately. But people have been texting me and saying, hey, what was that link? I couldn't find the link.
Right.
But days later, and they realized that something had happened that they wanted to know about.
They can still see it.
And they can still go get it.
It lives.
Yes,
it
exactly.
Lives. And I think that's what technology has been able to give us with news, is that it lives. It's like an organic body that lives out there, because you can post it or we can keep it, and you can text me and say, hey, that interview that you did last night with Ruben Solario, this deacon that did this really powerful, call to his parish about living Black Lives Matter. And he said, and he came out and said Catholicism is inherently racist. And he did this super challenging thing to all Catholics out there. Can I see that again? And I'm like, yeah, this is where it lives. Go experience it.
This is where it lives.
Yeah, and I think that's the beauty of technology, what we're able to do now, and it's such a integral part of how we research things now. But again, that comes back to what are the verified sources? I always tell the story when people ask me about how do you find information on the internet. And when I talk about, to people of like, you have to know what your verified sources are. You have to know where you're getting your information, right? You have to know that what you're looking at, who put it up there, who's the source behind it, because a lot of them times they sound really professional and really, seems like it's legitimate. But then when you do a little bit deeper, you're like, oh, this is paid for by this group, right?
Right.
Or even things that are in our common day. Like people always say to me, oh, I look up stuff in Wikipedia. And I love Wikipedia because my Wikipedia page is completely false. People have gone in and fixed it for me, and I got upset because I liked it when it had all the mistakes. Yeah. Because I used it as a way to teach people. Because I'd be like, well, who uses Wikipedia? And then I'd be like, who's looked at my Wikipedia? Let's pull up my Wikipedia page, and they'll do it, and I'll be like, so where does it say I was born? And they'll be like, Aventura, Florida. I'm like, yeah, I wasn't born there. Right? Or what school I went to? I'm like, yeah, I didn't go to that school. Or for a long time, which I actually liked, it had my wrong birth date. It had me like 10 years younger than I was. I'm like, yeah, that one I'm keeping. I like that fact a lot. Don't touch that one. And then someone in and changed it. So like now I don't like it anymore.
Curse you, facts.
I know. But it was riddled with things that were blatantly false.
Right.
And it occurred to me one time that it happened because I was at an event and someone introduced me and it was clear that they had used my Wikipedia page to, formulate the introduction to me.
Okay, when you say something lives somewhere else, mm-hmm. Okay, nobody's going to dispute that. There's a link, you go look, that's where it stays, right? Mm-hmm. But it seems that like say you go and do a show mm-hmm. with Marcus Washington and you guys have a certain conversation, okay, and you had questions or you had misconceptions or whatever it is, and you keep doing this show, and I hope you do. Mm-hmm. A year from now, that Jessica might be different than the one a year before. 100%. But that year before is still living somewhere.
Right.
And people very frequently will take one version of you that's now stored forever. And they can see it, they can hear it. They're like, that's you saying that.
And that's what you said.
And now it's so easy to access these past lives.
And to weaponize that.
Yes, to weaponize, but it's such a curious thing because we're so used to seeing somebody. It's like if I see you today and you say, hey, look, I think the sky is blue, then I take it as, oh, you're saying the sky's blue. If I watch you on a TV show, mm-hmm. From a year ago, and I'm seeing you say like, oh, I think the sky is purple, then I would see you like, wait, no, you said the sky is purple. You're like, that was me in a different lifetime. Like this a year ago.
And we're unable to accept change or that people can educate themselves or learn or change. And I think that's a huge issue that we have, as a society, that we love to talk about growth. Oh, I'm growing. Oh, yeah, I'm personal growth. I mean, look how many millions of dollars are spent on self-help books of like, I'm growth. I'm in a growing period. And yet we love to take that on as our own, identity. I'm growing. But we're unwilling to accept that in other people. Right. We'll be like, but you said the sky was green.
You're the same. You're completely the same.
And you'll be like, I know, but, I kind of read a couple of books and now I believe the sky is blue because I've educated myself on this issue. And people will be like, well, no, you said the sky was green before, so you must be an advocate of green skies. I just think, we're so polarized and we're so ready to point at other people and say, and this is a conversation I've been having a lot with students about tolerance and being able to concurrently live alongside people that don't completely share your values, your ideas, or your goals, and still have a level of respect for them. I think that's something that we've so lost. And you cannot have a conversation in which you're going to walk away and having learned something unless you are willing to listen to someone else's ideas, even if they are completely the antithesis of what you believe. But you have to listen, because it's until you listen that you're able to go, okay, I can see that's your experience. Now let me tell you my experience. And then that's how you end up meeting in the middle. I think that's why that Race in America show that we're doing is so important. Because you can know something kind of intellectually, but until you feel the other person's experience, it doesn't help you soften your position. And a good example of that is one time when we were doing the Race in America show, we had a family on. And obviously I've known this, I've been a news reporter for 30 years. I've done stories on it. I know the whole experience of driving while black. We all know what that means, or driving while brown. And I know it. And there was this family that allowed us to watch them have the conversation, or they talked to us about the conversation that they were having with their 15-year-old son about, my daughter's, my youngest, as you know, has just been driving for a little bit, and having the conversation of like, okay, so if you get pulled over, these are your things that you need to do to make sure you don't get shot. And I remember listening to that, and I was emotionally stunned. Not intellectually stunned, but emotionally stunned, because I couldn't fathom thinking about, so every black family in America is having this conversation where you have to go through steps so that you guarantee you don't get killed? Hang on a second. This kid's 12, this kid's 13, and we're having these conversations?
Right.
So that made me stop and think. And I was like, wow, I can't believe this. So when you hear something like that, you have to take a step back and go, okay, your experience is different than my experience.
Right. I have a good friend. His name's Barry. He highly educated, went to Harvard, and his wife is an attorney, and Barry's a monster. They met at Harvard. Barry happens to be black, right?
Yeah.
Very dark skin, and his wife happens to be Caucasian. They have a wonderful family, and his kids are darker skinned. Okay, so he told me this years ago, and it really very similar to that. So it was after the Trayvon Martin case, and he told me that he was driving home one day. They lived in Walnut Creek. And he saw his son run into his friend's house, okay? And he pulled over and grabbed his son. He's like, get in the car. And he was like, all right, I'm just going to Jeff's house. And he's like, listen to me. Never run in our neighborhood. He's like, I'm just running to my friend's house. I'm like, I don't care.
Oh, God.
You had a backpack on. You're running to your friend's house. And he's just hustling, going to see his friend,
Right,
going
yeah.
to play like
Like
Call
any
of Duty or
kid would
something.
do.
Exactly. And he was like, don't ever run in our neighborhood. Do you understand me? And the kid was
And
really
what
kind
I
of,
have the visceral reaction to have that, because that's a visceral reaction. Like, you can't run because something's going to happen to
do
you.
not do that. I don't want anyone following you. I don't want anyone questioning you. I don't want
call the
anyone.
cops
He's
on
like,
you?
you walk calmly at all times. And I know if somebody wants to, they'll listen to what we just said and say, well, not every black family has this conversation. Yes, fine. That's fine. Maybe it's not every single person. But the fact that people close to us or people that we can talk to are having this conversation, and it's not a conversation I would ever think to have. I'm actually Mexican, but I don't look it. I recognize
Right.
that. But my children, a couple of them are fairer skinned than I am. And I would never think to say like, hey, don't run to your friend's house down the street. Just the fact that we have people close to us that feel a real need to have that conversation is one of those things that should wake people up at least a little bit, not to the whole experience other people are having. You're not going to wake up to their experience, but wake up to the idea that there are these vastly different experiences that other people are living every day as we live our experiences. I mean, just incredibly different, and some that would cause very visceral reactions in us if we took to heart what they were going through.
Yeah.
So with that, how do we how do we try to help people? Because these questions, or excuse me, the conversations that we're starting to have are incredibly valuable. I have adopted siblings and they're black, or two of them are. And my dad is raising them as well as he can. He's raising them to be men. His line was actually, he's like, look, I can't teach you how to be black, but I can teach you how to be a man. Mm-hmm. Right? And that's his piece. And he's doing the best job he can. And of course, nobody's going to be perfect. But the point is, as we're starting to have these conversations, as we're starting to, you have your show and we're starting to air out this just mess that we find ourselves in, how do we start to talk to people about believing in change in other people to the level that they believe in change in themselves? Because like you pointed out, everybody believes they can change their opinion, but they're so fast to demonize someone else. And that
and not believe that person can change as well.
Yes, and that hang up, that one thing, in my opinion, it's one of the greatest wrenches in actual change. Because what's going to happen then is, if nobody believes someone else, if everybody believes like, hey, look, we're plastic, we're malleable, you can change, then somebody will come out and say like, all right, look, this is kind of what I've been thinking, or this is what I thought, but I think differently now. Or they'd be willing to say, hey, look, I have these thoughts and I'd like to talk, and it doesn't have to be in a public manner, but we can come out and say, hey, I did this in the past, or this is what I used to think, but I don't really want to think that. So help me. I don't think that's a perfect way to think. So help me understand more of it. And then if everybody's receiving and saying, okay, well, yes, people are malleable, right? Like, you may have thought that, you think this now, wonderful. The problem is, we're not willing to accept that in people. So you can't, it's dangerous for people to come out and say, hey, I used to think this, or I have thought this until now, and I don't think that's a good idea, and I want to change.
And that stunts growth, because
you're
unable.
You can't air it out.
No.
So how do we start emphasizing that? Because at one point, some people would say, look, lead by example. But that's almost like suicide. Like, how many people, prominent people, are going to come out and say, look, I've made these mistakes in life, but I'm a different person. And you can be a different person, and your neighbor can be a different person.
It's such a complex situation, too, and a complex question, because on the one hand, we're unwilling to trust that people are really changing and that their motives are earnest, right? But on the flip side, we love a story of redemption. As humans, we love the story of redemption. We love when someone's down and out, when someone makes a mistake, and when someone comes and says, I'm a broken person, I made a mistake, and I vowed to change. We love, so it's such a dichotomy, because we love those public, displays of redemption, and at the same time, we're unwilling to trust those one-on-one stories of, okay, I'd like to know more. But I do think that more and more people, as we're kind of taking this universal step back and trying to understand ourselves and trying to understand other people better, that people are delving more into, okay, I'm going to have this conversation, but I'm a little bit, afraid. And so, Glennon Doyle, in her book Untamed, talks about how sometimes you step out of that box and you make a mistake and you're going to get slapped down, but you need to take the slapping, sit, listen, and then say, okay, I'm going to start again, and I'm going to do more listening than talking. We love to talk, right? As a side, that's the whole thing we started off this show talking about. Everyone's got an opinion. Everyone wants to be heard. But where are we as listeners? And when I do that, when I train, when I work with some of my interns or work at the station with, or I teach classes on journalism, they'll often say to me, what do you do? How do you do a successful interview? And I'll ask the question. I said, what do you guys think is the key to a really good interview? And everybody will be like, oh, preparation. I'm like, yeah, preparation's good. Really putting my questions together. I'm like, yep, that's good too. And then I'll be like, no one's gotten the answer to what a good interview is. And finally I'll say, listening. I prepare for an interview. Most of the time I'll say I'll go into an interview knowing exactly what you're going to say, right? Because that's my job, to be able to know what you're going to say ahead of time, because I'll read everything on you. I'll prepare a document with the questions or the points or the things that I'm interested in, and then I go in and I put my paper down, and then I just listen. Because it's in those moments of just listening that someone will say something and it'll take you down a different path that you haven't explored. That wasn't in the 20 articles that you read about that person. That gives them an opportunity to say something that you can then move the conversation from a, kind of patent conversation that everybody has to something different, to something more meaningful. And it's all really about listening. And another thing is also about not always having to feel that you have to fill the space. It's sometimes when you and I can sit in silence a little bit, it's when those moments of epiphany come and truth and connection where you can reflect for a moment and say, I'm not going to give you the pat answer that I have. I'm actually going to take this moment, I'm going to give you a real answer. And that's what a good interview or a good conversation comes from just listening.
Do you think one of the issues, though, is that we have such a draw to displaying ourselves? Right? I think that's saying it lightly. But we have such a draw to displaying ourselves, to putting ourselves out there, to expressing ourselves. But the major issues that we fall into are that when we're doing that, we're just talking, right? Like when I'm trying to express myself, when I'm putting myself out there, it's necessarily me expressing something. And we love that, and we get kudos for that, and snaps, and we get like all this feedback. But the real growth comes usually not when you're talking, but when you're listening.
100%.
And it can't be displayed publicly. Because if you just want to take a video of me listening to somebody, and I am the subject where I'm just observing, that's not a great video. It's a far better video to pan the camera to the person preaching and telling me how it is. And then people are like, oh, snap. Nobody cares about listening because it's not popular to listen. That's one, and the growth that you get. The only way you don't have somebody questioning your motives is if you have an absence of ability to have a motive, right? So like if all of this was off, if we were just sitting here and you were like, you know what, Matt, let me tell you something, right? I would know that it's just me and you. So I wouldn't say, well, she's telling me this for this reason, or she's probably, though my favorite is like, she's just doing this for this reason. It's like, right. Okay, you can boil everything down to one singular motive. But the point is, I agree with you. It's listening that allows people to understand each other. But we're so drawn to display our life, to display our wokeness, that we can't actually show ourselves listening, which always, in my opinion, makes somebody on social media who's like talking the truth. It's like, oh God, what are we doing?
When they start with talking the truth, that's when you know we're in trouble.
Oh my God,
right?
I'm going to speak my truth.
Exactly. And that whole woke thing, we've had this conversation, Marcus and I, on TV about being woke. It's such a term now that is so cool and everyone wants to be woke. But if you were really woke, you wouldn't be saying you were woke. You know what I mean? Because there's so much to learn that it's not finite. There is no ending to it. It's just a process. It's not like I'm going to get to the end of the table and I'm woke because I read all these books.
I've done it. I nailed it. I got the whole thing.
Exactly. But I think it's a lot of us where we are as a society, right? Like, what are the things that we value? And I think this is one of the good things that's happened in the pandemic. We haven't talked about the pandemic. We can move in that direction. But, one of the things that we have valued is, it went from being popular in high school to now being popular in the world.
Oh my gosh, right.
Right? Right. Just before, you just had to be popular in high school, for God's sake.
Once a week, my students will come in and somebody will say, I got TikTok famous.
And
I always wonder.
Including my Olivia, which right? And you saw that video, right?
And it was like, wait, what does TikTok famous mean? And they explained it like, that means you get a bunch of hits on a little 10 or 20 or 30-second video. We're like, okay, well, what's famous? Is that like 10,000 people? And they'll say,
Millions!
no. I got like hundreds of thousands or millions of people.
Olivia got a TikTok video where she got 3 million views. And ragging on me, by the way.
Look at you. Look at
ragging on me publicly, and she got 3 million views. But
what is that, though? That's us trying to... Okay, anyway, I'm sorry. Keep going.
So what I'm saying is, like, okay, you used to just have to, there was the battle to be, famous or popular in high school. Now we have the battle to be popular globally. And everyone's, feeling about themselves, their self-satisfaction is based on a bunch of strangers telling you that was fantastic. So one thing that I've always said is, like, I don't really watch myself on TV, and I'm not bothered by people sending me emails saying they don't like me, because my policy is clear. I value the criticisms equally as I value the compliments, right? Because if you really sit down and stop, and you have some level of consciousness, right? When you've screwed up. You know yourself when you haven't done the good work. You know when you showed up ill-prepared. You know when, I probably should have really gotten better for that. And that didn't go as well as I should have done it. I didn't meet my expectations. I didn't deliver on what I should have given people, right? I didn't meet that. No one knows that more than myself. Right? So if we used our own internal barometer for being able to look at the work that we do or how we feel about ourselves, we would be in a much better position. But if I have to use your opinion of me to make myself feel better, well, your opinion of me is going to be based on your own experience, right? And your position. So it's not a legitimate assessment of who I am, right? You may have some really good points. Well, I'll be like, oh God, yeah. Matt told me I should have read that science book before I showed up to talk about, the world is round, but I didn't. So now his criticism is a fair one of me, right? But we don't do that anymore. It's all based on filters and how we can present ourselves to the world the best possible. And going back to my conversation about what viewers want to see on TV is they don't actually want to see someone who's perfect. When I screw up on TV, I'm like, I don't know that. Or sometimes I've said before, we've had kids on, like I had the spelling bee kid on one time and I did an interview with him and I literally looked at him, I said, you are so much smarter than me. It's embarrassing. You're like 12 and you are so much smarter than me. And the truth was that was an honest reaction on my part. Now, the people who watched me weren't like, well, we're not going to watch her anymore because she's not smarter than a 12-year-old, but they were like, that kid probably is smarter than her, but she can admit that he's smarter than her because he's probably smarter than the rest of us too. So we're going to like her because she's honest about the fact that 12-year-old is 100 times smarter than her. Right? And no, it's true. It was like, I don't really understand what you're saying at all.
I have an appreciation. I was actually just speaking with students about this. I think it was this last week because I said, look, smart to me is such an odd thing because you have to realize the limitations of what we're doing in this class. So, like if we're studying for the SAT or we're working on college essays, we're in the chute for a very specific thing, right? That's what our life goal is. But I always bring up my brother. So my brother has a PhD in neuroscience, right, from Princeton. It's like, look, there's no way in my lifetime I could catch up to the things that he knows. He's just that's what makes sense to him in the world. And it's beyond me. However, if I quizzed my brother on different types of wood joints, because I like woodworking, he would not know a half lap from a dovetail. Like, he wouldn't know anything about it.
Right.
So you can't take one tiny little intersection of somebody and just say, like, hey, this kid's ability to spell words really accurately, or my brother's ability to understand neuroscience, or my ability to build a cabinet. All of these things are different. The problem is we function so frequently in only one realm and assess intelligence in only one of those realms. And we dismiss everyone else as if it doesn't matter if you know how to build a cabinet, or it doesn't matter. I mean, think of just the spelling bee, right? Like, what a ridiculous thing. We have spell check now. And our vocabulary is far smaller than it was in Shakespeare days, right? Like, we use very short
and no one can spell because
That's right.
we have spell check.
Because we have spell check. So
no one can spell.
It's kind of like this guy being able to it's like Latin. It's like, well, okay, but that's kind of like polishing brass on the Titanic, man.
Or all the acronyms on texting. I'm always like, what does that mean?
Oh my God.
What does that mean?
How about BTW? It has more syllables than just saying by the way. Like BTW.
That's true.
Like, people love acronyms for no particular reason.
But how do we all adapt to this, right? I mean, 5 years ago, I would have said to you, I'm not using any of those acronyms. I'm in my position. I'm not saying that. I'm not doing that. I don't know what that means. And now I'm on my phone going, oh, FYI, BTW, OMG. And I catch myself sometimes going, I'm one of them.
I'm one of them.
I've become one of them.
But that's just the state of the world. That's just you communicating effectively with people. But one thing that I think is beautiful about our ability to see other people now, experience other people, is if you watch, I was trying to make a door, okay, a few years back. So
now I'm going to tell you the same thing I told that kid. God, you're so much smarter than me.
No, because I didn't know how to make it. So that makes me not very smart. But the point is, I was trying to make this door. So I looked up this video on how to make a door, right? And it was like a Bob
Stop
Vila.
yourself and talk about that. You looked up a video of how to make a door.
Right.
There it was.
And there it was. And it was beautiful. And you could dive into the complexity and the knowledge base that these people have. And it was such a humbling thing, because I was like, oh my God, they're talking about different woods. They're talking about different moisture content. They're talking about, different types of glues and clamps. And like, oh, snap. But it's only if you allow yourself to be humbled and seek that knowledge outside of your wheelhouse. If you just stick to your wheelhouse and say, well, look, I'm never going to build this door. I'll just go buy it and get some guy to install it. And by the way, I'm still really smart because I can do geometry and algebra. That presents such a skewed version of even yourself to the world. If you don't step out and allow yourself to be a complete miserable failure, then you get this very skewed perspective of yourself. So it's almost like you start believing in the Instagram profile, or like the myth of who you are.
Right.
You're
and
believing.
Then you don't, and then it imprisons you, because once you're in that myth, you don't want to let go of that myth, because stepping outside the myth makes you vulnerable, right? So yeah, I feel like a lot of those, it shackles you rather than frees you.
Yes.
To be curious and learn more. And that really comes to the core of that whole, you just touched on it, failure. I think fear of failure is one of the biggest detriments and obstacles that I see in students that I, train or that I work with, budding journalists. They're so afraid of appearing
less than,
incompetent, or less than, that they don't take the chances and actually fail. I have to say, I've learned more, it's a trite to say it, but I've learned more from my failures in this career than I have from the things that I've done well.
Right.
It's been those botched interviews. It's been those, bad, live shots. It's been those errors in judgment that I made as a journalist that have made me a much better journalist.
Right. You know what was beautiful about the TikTok that your daughter did? I did see it, where she was like bagging on you for having...
So we have to set it up. The TikTok is, I've been working from home during the pandemic. So the way we've handled it at the station is we rotate. Not all the anchors are in at the same time. And this really started early on, and we're still doing it, even though we have like a third of the staff back in. But at the beginning of the pandemic, there was only one person in the station. That was one anchor, right? And so what we did is we had one anchor in the studio, traditional, one anchor that would sit in the newsroom so you wouldn't cross-contaminate each other. You never were in the same area. And one anchor had to be home. And so we've been doing this rotation. So we've set up studios kind of like this in our own homes, right? And so it was the week that I was working from home. And for some reason, at first Olivia takes classes with Matt. Both of my daughters have, and they've done great. Olivia was going around, with her phone. I didn't really even know what she was doing. And it just kind of became a persistent thing where she kept asking me to take videos of me, and she'd be videotaping me all the time. And I was like, what is going on?
Yeah, get away. What are you doing?
And I didn't know the nature of it.
Right.
So then I find out later on, someone calls me and says, have you seen Olivia's video of you on TikTok? And I'm like, oh yeah, she's been going around taping me. And they're like, have you seen it yet? And I'm like, okay, your tone is making me a little worried. Now you go.
So this is the thing. She was so excited about it, right? Yeah. She was like, I'm TikTok famous. I'm like, what are you saying, right? Uh-huh. So she explains the whole thing, and I'm like, wait, why? What? People are watching? She's like, yeah, hundreds of thousands, look. She's like showing me her phone and how she
ended up with 3 million views.
Right. Mm-hmm. So the thing that I found so beautiful about that video, and the kudos she got for it, is that I often, it's a topic, social media is a topic in the class that it comes up a lot and we talk about it. I'm ruthless with people because I say, look, here's the deal. If you have Scott here, and Scott's some dude, and let's say Scott has like 3 ways to get famous. He's got to produce something, he's got to come up with some crazy idea, he's got to perform in some way, he's got to do something, okay, to get famous on, let's say, Instagram, right? I had one student who had this reasonably successful Instagram page that was all about him doing fidget spinners, and he had like almost 100,000 subscribers. So he was like designing these fidget spinners, and he'd do tricks like a hacky sack. So he'd spin this thing, hit it off his knee, his heel, his elbow, and then it'd land on his finger, and it was still spinning.
That's crazy.
So it was very cool. I was like, damn, son, look at you.
Yeah.
And there are other times when people say there's a girl, right? She was like, hey, I got TikTok famous. And after I realized this, I'm like, oh, whenever somebody says that, the vast majority of the time, if it's a girl, I can't look at the phone, even if they're trying to show it to me, because there's something there that I absolutely do not want to see. And that's one of the criticisms. I say, look, the girls have the options to do this. And I say this to the young women. I'm like, you have the option to do all the things Scott has the option to do. But you also have an option to just be completely inappropriate. And people will watch your TikTok because of that. You add some kind of innuendo. You add some kind of, skimpy attire. But that goes back
to, what do you want the value of you to be?
Yes, but I think it's so difficult when people are running around saying, I got TikTok famous, kudos for 3 million views, all this stuff. If they realize, okay, I could really just do this. Mm-hmm. And obviously, I'm hypercritical of that option because it's like, look, I say exactly that. Why are people watching you? They're not watching you for reasons that you want at all. And that's why I found Olivia so beautiful, because it was just a video of her like making fun of her mom, essentially, or saying like, oh,
which
look,
is what all kids do anyway.
It was so relatable. It was like, that is her mom. She's not being revealing or inappropriate at all, but it was that she avoided the temptation to fall into that pit and instead found an idea or found just a reflection on her own life that resonated with other people in some way. And I was like, that's what you need to do. That's why you need to be, supported on social media for an idea or a concept or something like that. And
so
it was great.
Video shows me actually in my studio. She comes and she videotapes me. Then she winds her way through the house with this kind of menacing music, and then she shows me on the TV. Right. Oh, no, it starts with her showing me on the TV, so you see me broadcasting. Then she comes over to the living room, and she sees me actually live broadcasting. And throughout, she's saying, who is this woman? Who is this woman? She looks really familiar. And then all of a sudden, the words say, oh, yeah, this is the blank that told me to go clean up my room today.
Right. Right.
Which someone asked me about it, and they were like, were you offended? And I was like, not at all. It was honest, because I am sometimes the bitch that goes to tell her to clean up her room, even though I am the TV news lady. Right. But I'm also a mom, and that's relatable to
And guess
anybody.
what? Your room is dirty. Go clean it up.
Everybody who has a teenage kid has at some point lost their minds and gone in there and go like, this has got to get picked up. So it was very, very funny. Then we had another TikTok video we did where we actually danced together. And she made me memorize a dance, and we did it. And that was super fun. But you kind of have to... all look at that, and that was honest. So I couldn't be upset about it because it was honest.
Right.
I had that day been like, you better pick up your mom, I'm gonna take car, I'm gonna take everything, you know.
Right.
I think it goes back to what are we looking for when we're searching online? You're looking for truth. And when you're trying to make a connection with a journalist or someone, you're looking for, does that person represent authentically to me?
Right.
You know?
Authenticity. We want it.
I'm not going to be perfect.
Right.
There are times I'm going to say stuff you're not going to like, because with authenticity comes risk.
Right.
You know, and so if I'm going to be authentic, and I do try to think sometimes, but there are times I will say what comes in the head comes out the mouth, right? So, but those are moments of authenticity.
I actually did a podcast on this about 3 weeks ago, that the irony right now is that we're searching so intensely for authenticity because we're surrounded by so much like scripted dances on TikTok or people being woke and saying just the right thing. So we're scrambling for authenticity, but we absolutely berate mistakes and missteps.
Yeah.
And it's kind of like, do you think that authenticity comes in a beautiful package?
It does not.
Like, if somebody's being authentic, it's not going to be pretty all the time. Like, maybe they're really good at speaking their truth, and maybe they're really eloquent and they can just speak off the cuff and make it sound good. But the vast majority of people that are authentic are going to make mistakes. And so we want this authenticity, but we also want it to be perfect. Which is obviously a problem. Because it's like, how is authenticity perfect?
It isn't.
That's the exact opposite.
Exactly. In fact, we had this conversation with this woman named Randy B. She's fantastic. She does a lot of work in the landscape of diversity and having conversations in corporate America. And you know, that's one of the same things that she said. She said, we're going to have this conversation and it's going to be ugly. And she goes, and that's the beauty of it. It has to be ugly to be beautiful, because if it's beautiful, it's not real, right? It's not real. So if you're going to have a conversation, let's have the conversation. Let's let it be ugly, and let's look at it and say the beauty of that is that it was ugly, and then let's walk away not stinging from the fact that it wasn't perfect.
Right.
You know, that pursuit of perfection has permeated every part of our society, whether it's how you look on TV, how you act in person, what you say on your Twitter, everything. That I believe it's like it's the prison of perfection.
It's so interesting that you say the prison of perfection. So I bag on safe spaces like it's going out of style. Because in my opinion, a safe space is a place that has to be perfectly safe, right? And because of that, it's actually an exceedingly dangerous place for a lot of people. If you're by yourself, like say you're in a room by yourself, that's fine. You're in a room and it's safe, and you're in a room, you're fine. But if the second you add one more person, because you're trying to achieve a state of perfection from a safety standpoint, anything that the other person says that could be perceived by you as dangerous or threatening or just not nice, right? Even to say like, oh, I like your hair today. Right?
What was wrong with it yesterday?
Right. So you can't have that. So I joke with students in my class. I say, look, this is the safest space you will ever be in, because there is nothing you can say that will get you in trouble. Because and of course there are boundaries, right? Like if somebody really got crazy, I'd be like, hey, just get out, right? But people don't. And by and large, what they realize is like, oh, I will be seen as a person. I'm not going to be seen as this perfect thing that should never say anything
or
by
a
mistake.
representation of something.
Yes, exactly. And there are students talking to me now about how they'll go to a sports practice. Okay, I had the student go to a soccer practice. And she was joking with her dear friend. She had like this best friend on the soccer team. And as people do with their closest friends, they were giving each other hard times for certain characteristics that they possessed. It's not like they were both very fair-skinned and they said something derogatory about dark skin. Like they were talking to each other with regard to each other's characteristics. And someone else that was not privy to the not part of the conversation, but heard it, just heard them talking to each other about each other. This girl was very offended, did not address it with them, didn't say, hey, could we just, she goes, to her parents, which go to the coach, and all of a sudden there's this team meeting where they're reprimanded for having a relationship or having their own relationship, right? And speaking to each other. And I was talking to them about this and saying, or excuse me, this girl was telling me it's really dangerous to be at practice because I have to worry so intensely about what I have to say because it's supposed to be safe. So it's dangerous for her because it's supposed to be safe.
Yeah, the irony.
And you start seeing this all throughout high schools where people are so worried about saying the wrong thing. These are supposed to be the safest possible places, but they become like these prisons where people are informing on each other and saying, like, taking this great offense when somebody could not be talking to you and not intending.
1963 Cuba.
This is exactly what I'm saying. Yeah. It's supposed to be safe, but because we're trying to attain perfect safety, perfection, it has become incredibly dangerous for people.
That's a really interesting dynamic, yeah.
Yes, but that's what's happening. That's what we're going towards. We're expecting people to be, at one, authentic, and at two, perfect.
Right.
And those two things are mutually exclusive.
They are. And I think the way that, I know the way that I've handled that in the past is when I've been authentically insulting to someone, right?
I really meant that. I really meant what I said. I genuinely dislike you. I'm not being silly.
Well, when I've made mistakes that people have been offended by, I feel that the best route is just to directly have a conversation about it and be like, oh, okay, well, wasn't my intention. That's how you took it, and how you took it is what's most important to you.
Right.
But to offer, an apology, and clarify is the only thing you can really do.
Right. And again, the fear of those types, as we become more reliant.
We see it more career enders for some people. You make one mistake, or in this sense now, the entire fabric of that team has been altered.
Right. They're no longer a team. They can no longer trust each other completely.
And when you can't trust completely, when you can't trust that you're that the fact that you're infallible, or that that you're going to make a mistake. When everyone thinks you're supposed to be infallible, there's no trust, because now I always have to be perfect. And to be perfect takes consciousness all the time. And when you're always thinking about how you're going to be perfect, you're not actually in the moment. You're not actually doing or being who you're supposed to be.
And you're just by the nature of your attempt to be perfect, you're limiting your capacity.
100%.
You're limiting your options. You're limiting the things you're willing to try and fail at. And you're limiting your ability to have any kind of real authenticity,
any real relationship with anyone around you.
Right. And this is at the heart of what I think is driving some of the mental ails that our younger people are experiencing, because they're feeling like they have to be perfect, and they're being told, oh, you better be perfect, because if you say anything wrong, even to your close friend, if anyone even hears it, there will be repercussions.
And I have to say, I think as parents, we're complicit. I know I've been complicit in that as well, and having these extraordinary, expectations of being caught up in the wheel that you can get caught up in, the affluence wheel of my kid has to do well, or everything's at stake, And I remember having that experience even when my daughters were young, that we lived in San Francisco, and, I don't think I didn't go to preschool. I know I didn't go to preschool. And kindergarten, my first day of kindergarten, I was the only kid in school that only spoke Spanish, right? Not a word of English, right? My parents were like, go, and my parents are immigrants, right? So although education was important to them, they couldn't really guide me through it.
Right.
I was kind of like, it was a sink or swim situation. You either did well, or I guess you're doing well, right? When they'd go see my teachers, it was mostly like, is she being respectful? Is she being nice?
Right. Is
all
she functioning?
Exactly. But, and
Right.
then when it get to higher learning and education and high school, and then certainly when I went to college, I just told my parents I was going to college. I was like, do you have a W-2 that I could borrow so I could do my financial aid form?
Right.
My parents were not involved at all, right? They were just worried about, are you going to be safe? You can't go too far from home, very much indicative of their station in life, of their culture, of their past experience, right? Neither one of my parents went to college until after I graduated college, right?
Wow,
So,
good for them. Good for them that they went eventually. Not good that they didn't have the opportunity, but that's wonderful.
Yeah, well, my mom went to college because when I went away to college in my neighborhood, which was a completely 100% Hispanic neighborhood, girls did not leave their families to go to college. I mean, that was just like, my parents were like, well, first of all, everyone in my neighborhood is a nurse or a teacher, okay, right? So my parents were like, go away to school.
Tell me your mom moved into college with you. Tell me she pulled up. She's like, okay, come on.
Wait. So my parents were like, go away. No. You're going to go to the community college down the street, and you're either going to be a teacher or a nurse. Because I was like, no, I'm going to travel the world. I'm going to be a journalist. I'm doing all these things. Or, I was a dancer like Olivia in high school. So I was like, or maybe I'll be a Broadway dancer. I had a lot of crazy ideas. Or maybe I'll be an astronaut. I was a bookworm. I had all these things. My parents always used to think I was a really odd kid to begin with because I wasn't like the other kids. I just loved my books, and I always talked about going away, and I always talked about other things. And, I'm old enough that I sat and watched Watergate, and my parents were like, why are you watching Watergate? I'm like, this is interesting. This is really interesting.
We're not recording this. This is the only
there is no recording.
There's
right?
only one time I can watch
I
this.
know, I've got to listen to this. And my mom would always say, was like, I think it's because you were born during the Kennedy assassination. They would link it to things like that,
God.
Yeah. So when it was time to go away for school, I had gotten into all these great schools, and my parents were like, yeah, no, you can't leave. And it was a crushing experience for me to not be able to go away for college, because it's the only thing that I saw as my opportunity to get outside this very insular world that I had,
Right.
And now when I reflect back on that world, I think, God, that was such a great place. It was there was such a gift in that. But at the time, I didn't see it as a gift. All I saw it as like, I needed more. I needed to move out. I needed to see the world. And so my parents finally agreed, because there was one other girl in town. There was one other, Vivian Segovia, whose parents were going to let her go to college away from Miami, because I lived in Miami at the time, and in this very Cuban community. And Vivian was going to go to Florida State. And they came and they talked to my parents about letting me go to Florida State. Now, I didn't want to go to Florida State.
I love the level of engagement that your parents and Vivian's parents,
Oh, no.
I literally, similar to you, I grew up in Concord, not Miami, but similar to you, it was like, can I just have your W-2? I had my paper out, and so I was paying for the applications with my paper out, and then they were like, what are you applying? Whatever, just do the.
Yeah. So they came over and they talked to my parents, and I didn't want to go to Florida State, and Florida State's a great school, whatever. I just felt like I had gotten into NYU, I had gotten into all these other schools. I felt like there was
more.
There was more, right? But at that point, I was desperate. So they said I could go to Florida State. But there was a caveat, and the caveat was we could go to Florida State, but our moms would come with us. I'm not kidding. Literally, there was that Melissa McCarthy movie a year ago, and I was like, she stole my life. And the girls know this.
Oh my
So my
gosh.
mom was first up, and she moved to Tallahassee and lived off campus, while Vivian and I lived in the dorms, and she would follow me to class. She'd be downstairs at my dorm. I lived in Sally Hall. She would come down in the morning, and she would be like, okay. and we would go from class to class to class. And I was like, don't trail me so closely. Just linger in the back, please.
I can't believe this
She
story.
was literally like auditing the classes, right? So she'd go,
So she'd sit into the classes with you.
yes.
I was about to say, what would she do when you were in
She'd go
class?
to class. And literally, like in big classes,
Don't
freshman
tail me
classes
so
are all these
closely.
huge classes. So they're all like 101 in the auditoriums. So she would just sit in the back, and it was mortifying. And then, there was no phones back then, so she couldn't text me. So she'd be down like, are we going to the student union now? And I'd be like, I'm going to the student union. You're doing something different, So the plan was she was going to be there for 6 weeks, and then Vivian's mom was going to come take over for a while. And then they were just going to ping pong because they needed to follow us around. So at the beginning, it was really embarrassing. And then a couple weeks in, she shows up one morning, and I see she has a backpack. And I'm like, why do you have a backpack? And she's like, oh, I'm taking notes. Very interesting. I love the religion class. This is me. I always make my mom's accent because
It's so great.
my mom has a heavy Hispanic accent, right? She's like, oh, and the thing is, my mom had me when she was 18, right? So at that point, she's not that much older than me, right?
She's like
she's
my age.
36,
Right.
right? I'm 18, she's 36, following me around. So she kind of blends, so no one's really noticing.
She probably had nice skin, too.
She looked
She's
like a
like,
grad student, right? So she's like, oh, I love the anthropology class. Very interesting, and that religion and science class, I love that one. So now I'm like, all right, whatever. Like midway through, I'm like, did you take notes in the religion class? She's like, oh, on the jingoist? Yes, I have. Except she calls it the yingoist. I remember that because, there's no J in Spanish, right? So it was a religion class, and I'd be like, can I have I missed the whole
I missed the
lecture.
notes. I was
and
looking
then
at a
she'd be like, yingoist, I have it. And I'm like, jingoist. It's with a J. Okay, you pronounce it with a J. So, yeah, so the beauty of that story is that she eventually did leave because my dad called. My dad still had my little sister, and my dad was like, enough of this. You've got to come home.
You got to get home.
So, and then Vivian's mom at this point was like, I'm not going. So we were left there to our own devices for a year. I ended up coming back, actually, after a year and going to the University of Miami, which is where I graduated from, and living home with my parents. But I found that Tallahassee wasn't my vibe. So I moved back in with my parents, got a full-time job, and actually went to the University of Miami. But after that experience, like maybe a year or two later, my mom enrolled in Florida International University and went through and ended up getting her degree in French literature, of all things.
That's wonderful.
I know, it's kind of crazy.
It's so unfortunate. It's not unfortunate. I had a college experience, went to Cal, and I loved my studies, but I also was rowing at the time, so I was always exhausted. My favorite time in college was I had to do a summer after I'd graduated, to graduate after my fourth year. And so I didn't have to row or work out at all over that summer. So all I had to do was take these 2 classes. And I had never been able to pull all-nighters writing because I always had to go to bed. So I literally, weeks away from when the papers were due, I was up at 3 and 4 a.m. writing these papers just because I wanted the experience of pulling all-nighters and writing at like 2 and 3 and 4 in the morning when the world is quiet. It was one of those things where it was like, God, I can't believe I missed the time that I had to do this.
Well, I know everyone's college experience is so different, right? Like now with my older daughter, Isabella, that you also was one of your students, she's having kind of like, well, right now, not because of the pandemic, obviously, but she wanted to have that classic college experience where you do the Greek life, where you do all of that. Those are an experience that is completely a different experience than I lived. I was a commuter college student, when I went to the University of Miami, and in I want to say it was either the last semester of my sophomore year, so my second year in college when I was with or maybe the first semester of my junior year, I was doing an internship at a TV station. And it was the Spanish station in town, Channel 23. And I had specifically picked the Spanish station to do an internship because I knew that at the English language TV stations, your traditional ABC, NBC, CBS stations, interns kind of just answered phones. They didn't really get to do a lot of work. I knew that at the Spanish stations, because you have to speak Spanish to go to the Spanish station, right? They needed so much more help that you got more of a real hands-on experience. So I decided to do that, and it was the truth. I had heard that from someone. About 4 weeks into my internship, the woman who I was interning under quits, and it was like one of those broadcast news moments where they looked at me and they're like, "Can you do what Darla does?" And I'm like,
Next up, get her in.
no, and I was like, "Yeah, but." They're like, "Fine, you're hired."
There's a Dolly Parton movie about that where she gets pulled onto the radio. She just like happens to be there for some reason. They're like, "Hey, look, you're it, right?"
Yeah.
And she's like, "I don't know, Daryl."
No, it really was. And they were like, I was like, "But you know, I go to school full time." They're like, "Fix your schedule, do whatever you need to." And so from that moment on, I went to school full time and I worked full time in a newsroom, right? Wow. So like I was 21 or something, maybe, or 20. I don't even remember. It's been so long. But so it took me a little bit longer to graduate because I was literally working full time.
Right.
And but I was having that real world experience. I mean, I remember I'd have my journalism professors say to me, "Can we come to the station to do a tour?" And I'd be like, "Okay, I'll set it up for you." And literally I'd come in, I'd teach them the tour, and I'm like, "Well, I'm the assignment manager. These are the jobs you get after college." And I already, because I, having worked there for 3-4 years,
amazing.
I worked up, from all the things until at one point I was like producing, one of the shows. I'd be like, "Hang on, I got to talk to the anchor," and then later on, that's who I became. So I always talk to students about that too, about like, I know how to do every job in a newsroom. I've done every job in a newsroom. And that's what makes me a good reporter, because I'm self-sufficient. I don't need to call the assignment desk to make a phone call for me. I don't need to know, what my access is to things. I know how to call for a satellite if I have to call for the coordinates myself. All those little intricacies makes me my own island when I'm reporting.
Right.
So
yeah, you're an autonomous, self-reliant functioning individual.
Exactly.
Well, listen, we blew past the 1 o'clock hard stop. Thank you for coming so much. Thank you for what you're doing, keeping us informed. Hopefully the first of many. We can do it again sometime.
Oh my God, it was a total pleasure, and I have to thank you for the work that you do and how you, the kids that you deal with on a day-to-day basis are at such a crossroads, at such a difficult time in their lives. There's such a level of doubt that they have and indecision about what they're doing. And I always hear, from you, not only are you imbuing them with this knowledge of how to take this test, but I think one of the things that they love about you the most is the connection that you form with them, the confidence that you give them. You are so attainable for them, that it just, I know that when they leave these classes, they always feel like, "Oh yeah, I'm going to be able to do this. I'm going to be okay." Yeah. And that's a gift to be able to give students right now.
Yeah, they need that more than ever. Yeah. It's wonderful. I love my piece in it.
Yeah,
it's
so
great.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.